Imagine it's 1943. The war is everywhere, in the newspapers folded on kitchen tables, in the gaps left at dinner by men who haven't come home, in the sound of the radio at night that everyone gathers around and nobody fully trusts. The world feels like a held breath. Now imagine you are in a small, slightly overheated office in Lisbon, Portugal. Lisbon is neutral, which means it is also the most dangerous city on earth. Neutral doesn't mean safe. Neutral means every intelligence service from every warring nation has set up shop in the same collection of cafes and hotel lobbies and consulate back rooms. All of them watching each other. All of them pretending not to. The city smells like salt water and diesel, and the particular kind of tobacco that drifts out of establishments where you probably shouldn't linger too long. You are sitting across from a man. He is well dressed, better than the Times warrant actually. His shoes are polished to a gleam that feels almost offensive given the rationing elsewhere in Europe. He has the easy, practiced calm of someone who has spent years learning to appear calm. He orders his coffee without looking at the menu. He already knows what everything costs. He hands you a folder. Inside that folder is something extraordinary. Detailed blueprints, troop movements, the rough outline of what would become one of the most consequential military operations in the history of warfare. The exact kind of intelligence that could end a war, or lose one, depending on which side of the table you're sitting on. His name is Juan Garcia, and if you were German, if this were the meeting you think it is, you would believe you had just found your most valuable spy. A committed fascist ideologue with genuine access to Britain's deepest secrets. A network of sub-agents spread across England, feeding him information so precise it makes your hands shake a little when you read it. Here is what nobody tells you about Juan Garcia. Every single one of those sub-agents was fictional. Every piece of intelligence in that folder was either completely fabricated or so carefully curated that it was more dangerous to the Germans than having no intelligence at all. The man sitting across from you with the polished shoes and the steady hands was the greatest double agent of the Second World War. But here's where the story gets genuinely strange and genuinely human in a way that takes a moment to land. He wasn't doing it for Britain. He approached the British first, and they turned him down. Twice. He was doing it because he had decided on his own, with no institutional backing and no real plan, that fascism was a catastrophic wrong and that he personally was going to do something about it. And yet, this is the part that keeps historians coming back to the story, turning it over in their hands like a stone that doesn't quite fit anywhere. The full truth of what drove him, what it cost him, and what he never actually received is far stranger and far sadder than the heroic version you've probably heard. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back to a boy in Spain who watched a war destroy everything around him and came out the other side with a plan that anyone sane would have told him was suicidal. Welcome to Echoes of History. If you're here right now, lying in the dark with your phone face down or your earbuds in, trying to let the day go, this is exactly what this channel is here for. A lot of people come to Echoes of History precisely for this, the long, slow drift into sleep carried by a story worth knowing. If that sounds like something you want to find again on a hard night, subscribing takes about 2 seconds, and it means the next time your mind won't quiet down, there'll be something new waiting. It genuinely helps more than you know. And drop a comment if you feel like it, your name, where you are, what time it is. I read everyone. And there's something I find genuinely moving about the map that forms. Here is what most people think they know about wartime spies. They think of charm. They think of languages spoken without an accent, of perfect covers, of institutional training and expensive equipment and networks built by intelligence agencies with centuries of combined experience. They think of James Bond, essentially, even when they know better. The reality of espionage in the Second World War, especially the extraordinary double-agent program run by British intelligence, was almost the opposite of that. Some of the most effective spies were, by professional standards, completely unqualified. They were salesmen, clerks, minor diplomats, bored housewives, petty criminals. What they shared wasn't training. What they shared was something harder to define and harder to teach. A facility for fiction, for understanding what a person wants to believe and for feeding that belief so consistently and so plausibly that it eventually became load-bearing. It became structural. It became the thing that actual German military decisions were built on. Juan Pujol Garcia was born in Barcelona in 1912. His childhood was comfortable, middle class, uneventful in the ways childhoods are supposed to be uneventful. His father owned a dye factory. He had a younger brother, a sister, the kind of family that ate meals together and argued mildly and assumed the future would arrive in an orderly fashion. The Spanish Civil War ended that assumption in 1936. What happened in Spain between 1936 and 1939 is a subject that could fill a library and still leave things out. But here is what it felt like on the ground. If you were Juan Pujol, you watched a country tear itself in half. You watched your family fracture along ideological lines. His mother was a committed nationalist. His father had died years earlier. His country became a testing ground for the weapons that Hitler and Mussolini were building for the larger war they intended to start. The Condor Legion, the German Air Force operating in Spain, dropped bombs on Spanish cities. Guernica, you know the painting. Less often discussed is the sound, the way the sky changes before ordnance falls, the way a street looks afterward. One served somewhat reluctantly on the Republican side. He deserted twice, not out of cowardice but out of what he would later describe as a profound disgust with ideological violence from any direction. He spent time hiding from both sides. He watched men he knew die for abstractions. He watched the abstractions calcify into things worse than the injustices they were supposed to cure. By the time the war ended, with Franco's victory with the nationalists in control, with Germany and Italy having essentially field-tested their military technology on the Spanish countryside, Juan Pujol Garcia had arrived at a conclusion that sounds simple but was actually the product of extraordinary suffering. Fascism was not a political position to be debated. It was a catastrophe to be stopped. He was 27 years old. He had no military intelligence training. He had no connections to any intelligence service. He had a chicken farm, briefly, that failed. He had a hotel, also briefly. He had a wife named Araceli, who was formidably strong-willed and whose role in the story we will come back to, because it is one of the most overlooked and important parts. And he had an idea. He was going to become a German spy. He was going to offer himself to the Abwehr, German military intelligence, and once he was accepted, he was going to start feeding them false information. He was going to build, single-handedly, a fake spy network. He was going to make the Germans believe they had an extraordinary intelligence asset in Britain, and he was going to use that belief to mislead them, at scale, at the moments that mattered most. He was also, as a backup plan, going to offer his services to British intelligence, who would presumably be delighted to have a man already embedded with the Germans. He went to the British first. In Madrid, in 1940, he presented himself to the British consulate and explained his plan. They turned him away. He went back. They turned him away again. The British, quite reasonably from their perspective, had no idea who this Spaniard was, had no way to verify his motivations, and had every reason to assume he might be a double agent working for the other side, which is to say working against them. So he went to the Germans. He walked into the German consulate in Madrid and told them he was a committed fascist with a deep hatred of the British Empire and access to high-level contacts in the UK. This was entirely fabricated. He had no contacts. He had never been to Britain. He had at this point a few travel guides and a map of the London Underground. The Germans believed him. Here is the thing about effective deception. It works not because the deceiver is particularly brilliant, but because the deceived has a powerful prior wish to believe. The Germans wanted good agents in Britain. They wanted networks. They were already running several operations that were, without their knowledge, entirely compromised. When a well-spoken Spaniard with a convincing cover story walked in and offered exactly what they needed, the structural hunger of the organization did most of the work. The Abwehr didn't scrutinize Juan Puyol Garcia as carefully as they should have, because doing so would have been uncomfortable. They gave him a brief training in secret writing, invisible ink, coded messages, a small amount of money, and sent him off. Juan Puyol Garcia moved to Lisbon, and in a small rented room with his travel guides and a Portuguese railway timetable and a great deal of raw nerve, he began to write letters. The letters that Juan Puyol Garcia sent to his German handlers from Lisbon, letters they believed were coming from Britain, are extraordinary documents when you read them now. They are specific in exactly the right way. They have the texture of real intelligence. The prose has the slightly cautious quality of a man managing sources, covering himself, worried about exposure, and threaded through them constantly are reports from a growing network of sub-agents. There was a Welsh nationalist who hated the English and was perfectly placed to observe naval movements in Glasgow. There was a Portuguese businessman who travelled extensively through Britain for work. There was a waiter in a hotel frequented by British officers. There was a Venezuelan student, a South American of independent means, who moved in well-connected circles. None of them existed. Every single sub-agent was a fiction built in a rented room in Lisbon by a man with a map and an extraordinary imagination. Their personalities were consistent. Their backgrounds were internally coherent. They had habits and flaws. The Venezuelan, for instance, was prone to embellishment, which gave one a convenient out when a report turned out to be slightly inaccurate. Their reports contained real enough feeling detail to be plausible, but were either too late to act on, were already known to the Germans from other sources, or contained subtle misdirections that compounded over time. The Germans were delighted. Their new agent, whom they had codenamed Alaric, though history would come to know him by the name British intelligence later gave him, Garbo, was producing gold. Meanwhile, British intelligence in Madrid had begun to notice something odd. There was a Spanish-run network reporting to the Germans from what appeared to be inside Britain. And the reports, while not catastrophically dangerous in themselves, were convincing enough that they were causing confusion. Someone was running a very good fake operation. But British intelligence didn't know who, and didn't know if it was actually fake or if there was a genuine leak somewhere. They started looking. It took a while, but in the spring of 1940, a British intelligence officer named Thomas Harris, Spanish by background himself, which mattered enormously for reasons we'll come to, tracked the source of the Alaric network to Lisbon, to a man in a small apartment who had been single-handedly fooling German military intelligence for 18 months. British intelligence, which had turned him down twice, finally said yes. They moved him and his wife and their young son to Britain. They gave him the code name Garbo after the actress because, as one officer reportedly said, he was the best actor they had ever seen, and they gave him something even more valuable than resources or training. They gave him Thomas Harris as his handler. The partnership between Juan Puyol Garcia and Thomas Harris is one of the great collaborations of the war. Harris was half Spanish, spoke the language fluently, had a deep instinct for narrative and for the German analytical mind. Together they built Garbo's network into something breathtaking, a fictional army of 27 sub-agents, each with their own file, their own personality, their own past story, their own section of Britain to report on. Some of them died, dramatically, with farewell letters. Some of them were arrested by fictional British security forces, which gave Garbo a chance to express outrage and alarm and solicit German sympathy. Some of them turned out conveniently to have been duped, which allowed the occasional piece of accurate information to pass through without it compromising the network's overall architecture of misdirection. The Germans paid for this. They paid well. By the end of the war, the Abwehr had funneled the equivalent of what would be millions of dollars today through Garbo, financing his fictional network, paying his fictional sub-agents, reimbursing fictional expenses for fictional travel to fictional observation posts. But here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Juan Pujol Garcia never got most of that money. The funds were controlled by British intelligence. They were used to fund the broader deception operation. The modest salary he was paid was supplemented occasionally, but the vast sums the Germans believed were flowing to his network, the money that was, in a sense, the Germans paying for their own undoing, went elsewhere. He was not doing it for money. He'd never been doing it for money. But the money, or rather the absence of it, becomes important later. It becomes part of a larger betrayal. Quieter, more institutional, and in some ways more disorienting than any of the wartime deception. For now, though, for this moment in the story, the machine was running, and it was about to be asked to do the most important thing it had ever been asked to do. The year is 1944. The war has turned, but turning and ending are different things. Germany is still a military force capable of catastrophic resistance, and the Allies are planning something. Operation Overlord. The invasion of France. The thing that history has crystallized into a single word. D-Day. Here is what military planners understood clearly. If Germany knew where the landings were going to happen, if they could concentrate sufficient force on the beaches of Normandy before the assault, the invasion could fail. And if the invasion failed, the war in Europe extended by months, perhaps years. More cities reduced to rubble, more people in camps, more of everything that the word war barely contains. The entire operation depended in part on one question. Could you make the Germans believe the landings were happening somewhere else? The answer was Operation Fortitude, and at the center of Operation Fortitude was Garbo. The strategy was this: convince German high command that the main Allied invasion force was aimed at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, the most logical target, the place where a defending army would position itself, rather than Normandy, which lay farther west and less intuitively. The Allies had built an entire fictional army group, called FUSAG, the First United States Army Group, under the nominal command of General George Patton, who was flamboyant enough and feared enough by the Germans that his presence at the head of this phantom force made the whole fiction more believable. Inflatable tanks, fake radio traffic, carefully managed leaks all contributed to the impression. Garbo was the keystone. For months before the invasion, his network filed reports placing the main invasion build-up in southeast England, consistent with a Calais target. His sub-agents observed troops, equipment, supply lines, all of it pointing in the wrong direction. The reports were detailed, coherent, professionally assembled. They arrived regularly. The Germans trusted them. Then came June 6, 1944. The landings happened, and here is where Garbo did something that required a kind of nerve that is difficult to fully appreciate from this distance. At 3 in the morning on June 6, before the German High Command had fully processed what was happening while the landings were still in their opening hours and could still theoretically be repelled, Garbo sent a message to his German handler that would define the war. He told them, "This is not the main invasion. Normandy is a feint. The real thrust is still coming at Calais. The main Allied force has not moved. What you are seeing on the beaches is a diversion." He was, of course, lying. But the Germans believed him. Hitler had already ordered 2 panzer divisions to reinforce Normandy, armoured units that could have driven the Allies back into the sea in those critical first hours when the beachhead was at its most vulnerable. He rescinded that order. He held the armour in reserve for the main attack at Calais that was never going to come. Those hours mattered. Those panzer divisions, held back by a fiction assembled in a room in Lisbon years before, left the beaches of Normandy fractionally less defended than they could have been. The foothold held. You know the rest, or at least you know the shape of the rest. the breakout from Normandy, the liberation of Paris, the long push east, the collapse of the Reich. And a few months later, in 1944, the Germans sent Garbo a medal, the Iron Cross First Class, awarded to a man who had spent 4 years systematically dismantling their ability to make accurate decisions. Juan Pujol Garcia is, to this day, the only person to have received both the Iron Cross from Germany and the MBE, Member of the Order of the British Empire, from Britain, one awarded in genuine gratitude by people who had no idea what they were doing, the other representing an organization that had turned him away twice before finally recognizing what he was. Think about that for a second. 2 medals from opposite sides of the most catastrophic war in human history, both of them real, both of them deserved in ways their givers couldn't fully know. And then, here's where it gets strange and sad and human in a way the heroic version of the story tends to skip over. The war ended, and the life Juan Pujol Garcia had built, the life he had constructed piece by painstaking piece in a rented room in Lisbon, collapsed. After the war, Juan Pujol Garcia did something unusual for a man in his position. He disappeared, not metaphorically, not in the sense of retiring quietly. He actually disappeared, fabricated his own death, told his wife and children he had died of malaria in Angola, and vanished into South America. He ended up in Venezuela, which was where his fictional sub-agent had supposedly come from, which is the kind of irony that a novelist would probably be told is too neat. Why did he disappear? The answer is complex and not entirely resolved by historians, but some of the threads are visible. His marriage to Araceli had not survived the war. Araceli Torres was a remarkable woman, strong-willed, fiercely opinionated, and deeply ambivalent about the operation she had been pulled into. She had actually, at one point during the war, threatened to go to the Spanish embassy and expose the entire Garbo network unless British intelligence paid more attention to her and her children's needs. This was not a small threat. This was a woman who understood leverage. British intelligence managed the situation, but the marriage itself was already fracturing under the weight of the secrecy and the uprooting and the impossible strangeness of the life they were living. Araceli eventually emigrated to the United States with their children. Juan went the other way. Then there was the money, the vast sums the Germans had believed were flowing through the Garbo network. The reimbursements, the sub-agent salaries, the operational funds had been held by British intelligence. After the war, the accounting was murky. Juan had been told he would be compensated. He was not, at least not proportionately. The financial settlement he received was modest and felt to him like an insult given what he had risked and what he had delivered. He had offered himself unbidden, with no institutional support, and had single-handedly deceived German military intelligence for 4 years. He had contributed, directly, demonstrably, to the success of the most important military operation in the Western European theatre. He had received a modest salary, a medal, and then the slow, awkward silence of an organization that had gotten what it needed and no longer knew quite what to do with him. He spent decades in Venezuela. He ran a bookshop. He taught English. He married again. He had a quiet life. Quiet in the way that lives lived after extraordinary events sometimes become quiet, as if the universe had used up whatever it had allocated to that particular person and left them the remainder in peace. He was almost completely unknown. The full story of the Garbo network wasn't declassified until the 1980s. The historians who pieced it together found a trail that led to a small town in Venezuela. They found Juan Pujol Garcia. In 1984, 40 years after D-Day, he finally went back to Britain. He met the veterans. He walked on the beaches at Normandy. He was 72 years old. There is a photograph from that visit. He is standing on the beach. The wind is doing something to his jacket. His face is entirely unreadable. He is looking at something the camera can't see, something in the direction of the water. What do you imagine he was thinking? What do you imagine it feels like to stand on a beach and know, really know, in a way you could never fully say out loud, what you had contributed to what happened here? What you do with that 40 years later, when the world that was saved has moved on and doesn't quite know your name? Here's what the evidence actually shows about his motivations. By the end, he was not bitter. People who met him in those last years described a man who seemed genuinely at peace with how his life had unfolded. He had done what he had set out to do. He had decided fascism was a catastrophic wrong, and then had improbably done something about it on a scale he could not have imagined when he was a young man with a failed chicken farm and a map of the London Underground. The money he never fully received, the wife he lost, the years in anonymity, these were real losses, real costs. He carried them. But they hadn't hollowed him out. There is something in that worth looking at carefully. Let's step back now. Let's look at what the story of Juan Pablo Garcia actually reveals. Not about espionage, not about the Second World War specifically, but about something deeper. Something about how human beings operate under pressure. Something about the machinery of belief. Here is the strange philosophical core of the Garbo story. It worked because of how minds build trust. The Germans didn't just receive information from Garbo and act on it mechanically, as if processing data. They built a relationship with him. They developed, over 4 years of consistent, detailed, personally credible communication, something that functions almost like affection. The particular warmth an organization develops toward an asset that keeps delivering. They gave him the Iron Cross, not just as a strategic calculation, but because they liked him. Because Garbo the fiction had become, in their internal world, a real person with a real personality and a real track record. And that emotional investment was precisely what made him so effective. When Garbo told them on the morning of June 6 that Normandy was a feint, they didn't just consider the claim on its merits. They weighted it by everything they felt about the source. They trusted him for 4 years. He'd never been wrong. Of course this was accurate. Their trust became the weapon. This is not unique to espionage. This is how all effective deception works. At the level of relationships, nations, markets, ideologies. The con isn't in the specific lie. The con is in the years of consistent behavior that make the lie unthinkable to doubt. Think about your own life. Think about the times you've been most wrong about something. Not wrong because you lacked information, but wrong because you trusted a source so thoroughly that contradictory evidence bounced off. The Abwehr was full of intelligent, experienced intelligence professionals. They were wrong not because they were stupid, but because they were human, because they had needs. Because the need to have a good agent in Britain was strong enough that it shaped how they read everything that came from one. And here is the inverse. Juan Pablo Garcia was most dangerous to the Germans precisely because he was consistent. He didn't try to pull off one massive deception. He built slowly a reputation for accuracy that could be cashed in at a critical moment. He understood intuitively, without any formal training in psychological operations, that credibility is a resource. You accumulate it in small transactions and spend it in large ones. He spent his on June 6, 1944. Now here is the question that keeps me awake a little when I think about this story. Juan Pablo Garcia invented 27 people. Over 4 years, he wrote their personalities, their habits, their fears, their professional opinions, their relationships with each other. He killed some of them. He gave others dramatic reversals of fortune. He built a world populated entirely by his own imagination and then maintained that world so consistently that the most sophisticated intelligence apparatus of the Third Reich could not distinguish it from reality. What does it mean to spend 4 years of your life in a fiction you've created? What does it do to a person, to their sense of self, to their relationship with reality, to their ability to distinguish between what they genuinely believe and what they have persuaded themselves to believe in service of a larger purpose? He faked his own death at the end of it. He went to the country his most beloved fictional character came from. He built another life, smaller, quieter. Was the disappearance somehow a way of beginning again? A way of shedding a self that had spent 4 years not entirely being itself? I don't know. Nobody really knows. But the question feels important in a way I can't fully articulate. Something about the cost of sustained performance. Even performance in service of something genuinely good. Even when you win, something is spent. Something doesn't come back. We carry the Garbo story with us, whether we know it or not. Every person reading about the D-Day landings, every story about the liberation of France, every accounting of what it cost and what it won, all of it rests in part on the work done by a man in a rented room in Lisbon with a travel guide and a map of the underground. But what does it reveal about us? About human nature in general, beyond the cleverness of it? I think it reveals something about the relationship between belief and identity. Juan Pujol Garcia was effective because he understood, at an almost cellular level, that people are not primarily rational. They are primarily narrative. They do not evaluate evidence against a neutral background. They evaluate evidence against a story they are already telling themselves. The Germans had a story. We have a valuable agent in Britain. Every piece of new information got read against that story. Information that fit the story was accepted. Information that contradicted it was explained away. This is not a German failure. This is not even specifically a wartime failure. This is what human minds do. It is what your mind do. What your mind does, right now, every day, without your awareness. You have stories about yourself, stories about the people around you, stories about what is possible and what is not. Evidence that fits those stories feels like confirmation. Evidence that contradicts them feels suspicious. The extraordinary thing, the thing Juan Pujol Garcia somehow understood without a psychology degree, is that those stories can be managed from outside. You can feed a story. You can water it like a plant with consistent small details that make it more vivid and more resistant to doubt. And then, when the moment comes, you can pivot, not by breaking the story, but by extending it. By adding a chapter that only makes sense within the logic of the story you've been building. The Normandy landings were a feint. Of course they were. Look at the intelligence. Look at Garbo's track record. Of course. What does this mean for how you navigate the world? What stories are you inside of right now? About people, about situations, about what's possible, that have been watered and tended by someone who understands exactly how you read evidence? That question is uncomfortable. It is meant to be. It is the question Juan Pujol Garcia's life places in front of anyone who thinks about it long enough. And maybe it is also a kind of gift, the slightly uncomfortable gift of awareness, the recognition that credulity is not weakness but humanity, and that knowing this is the beginning of something more deliberate. The night is very quiet now, wherever you are. Feel the weight of your body, the particular temperature of the air around you, the way the darkness has settled in since you first lay down. Somewhere in Venezuela, in the last years of his life, Juan Pujol Garcia would have lain down like this, in a quiet room with the night coming in through whatever window faced his bed. The sounds of a different city than the one he'd been born in, a different language than the one his mother had spoken. Did he think about the letters? The hundreds of letters from a room in Lisbon, the fictional sub-agents with their fictional reports, the invisible ink and the coded messages and the German handler who had trusted him completely. Did he think about June 6th? About the moment when the message went out and the Panzer divisions stayed where they were and the beach held? We don't know. He wasn't the kind of man who wrote everything down, and the things he said in his last years were characteristically calm and slightly elliptical. The speech of a man who had decided what he thought and didn't need to keep saying it. But think about what connects him to us, right now, tonight. He was a human animal lying in the dark, as all human animals lie in the dark, thinking about what he had done and what it had cost and what it had been worth. As you might tonight, as people have always done, going back further than history has, words for back to the time when there was no writing, no records, no testimony, nothing but fire and dark and the interior of a single mind turning things over. The stars he looked at from Venezuela are the same stars. The breath moving through a sleeping body is the same breath. Something in us has not changed since the first person lay down and stared at the ceiling and tried to make peace with the life they had lived. He made peace, in whatever form peace takes for a man who invented an entire world to destroy a real evil. He made it, and the beach held. Thank you for spending this time with Echoes of History. If this helped you drift off tonight, or if you learned something you didn't know you were going to learn, a like means more than you might think. It's how stories like this one find other people lying in the dark who need them. And if you want to leave a comment, your name, where you are, what time it is, what you're thinking about, please do. I read everyone. There is something quietly extraordinary about the fact that people all over the world are listening to the same story at wildly different moments, and I find myself genuinely moved by that. Subscribing to Echoes of History takes about 2 seconds, and it means the next time you need something to carry you out of the day, there'll be something new waiting. It makes a real difference. And if you ever want to go a little deeper to support the work and get a little something extra for it, the channel membership is there with no pressure attached. Every person who supports it helps make more of these nights possible. Now let go of the day. Let your breath slow. Let the stories settle. All the ones you heard tonight, all the ones you carry with you, all the ones that are still being written by people lying in the dark and deciding quietly what they are willing to do. Humans have been doing this since the very beginning, lying down under the vast and indifferent sky, turning the day over in their minds, passing the stories on. You are part of that chain. Sleep well.